This month we're doing 2 paper piece blocks. The first one is a paper piece flag. It is all just straight stitching, so it's very straightforward. I am using Totally Stable for my foundation this time. It will work exactly the same way as freezer paper, so you are welcome to use that. If you use freezer paper, you'll get it all in one piece if you trace it off the roll. If you use paper, you may have to tape your foundations together. Totally Stable is an iron-on tearaway stabilizer from Sulky, and I just traced the pattern right off the paper. In the kit for the flag are just 3 pieces. There's the red, the white, and the blue stars. The pattern gives cutting instructions for strips, and I am going to go ahead and cut those strips just because it'll make life a little bit easier. The piece, you will actually have a little bit left over at the end of your 11-inch strips. So let me go ahead and cut those. You can cut your strips any way you like, but this is the way I did it. I cut off my 2 strips that are supposed to be 2 inches by 17 inches. I think I actually gave you an 18-inch strip, and I did not cut it down to the 17. And then I cut 11 inches off here and then cut my 2-inch strips from the 11. In addition to the 2 17-inch strips of red and the 2 11-inch strips of red, you're going to need 2 17-inch strips, and they're all 2 inches wide, of the white or cream, and 1 11-inch of the white or cream. And I did not bother to cut down my stars. You can if you want to. I'm not going to show you step by step on this block because you've already seen the paper piecing technique last month. So I have done pieces 1, 2, and 3. So these are the 11-inch strips. My next step is the stars. I'm just going to scoot over just a hair because I want to make sure it covers. So all I'm going to do is go back to the sewing machine, and it's up to you whether you're stitching on the line or folding back like I showed you last month and sewing right next to the fold. So I finished on my paper piecing. The final step was to trim up the block to 6.5 by 16.5. So that's why I don't ever trim my outside edges till the very last step to make sure that it's as big as it needs to be. And that's what it looks like on that side. I was doing the method where I folded back my foundation and stitched next to the line. So why foundation piece this flag? It's all just straight stitching. If you look closely, the stripes are actually irregular shapes. They vary in width from one end to the other. So that's really the only reason to do this as foundation piecing. The second block this month is a house block. And so far our blocks have all been paper pieced on just one section. But a lot of times when you're paper piecing, you cannot paper piece the whole block in one section. So the house block is actually done in 5 sections. There's section 1, section 2, section 3, section 4, and section 5. On the part with the roof and the chimneys, she labeled what fabric went where, but that didn't happen in the bottom part of the house. So section 1, number 1 is a window, number 2 is house fabric, number 3 is the door, number 4 is house fabric, number 5 is house fabric, and number 6 is background. In section 2, number 1 is house, number 2 is window, number 3 is house, number 4 is window, number 5 is house, number 6 is house, and number 7 is house. And then in section 3, number 1 is house, number 2 is window, number 3 is house, number 4 is window, number 5 is house, number 6 is house, and number 7 is background. You can use whichever method you want. For the sections, you're just going to paper piece them just like we have everything else, starting with number 1 and going through consecutively. I'm actually going to do 2 different methods, not because I recommend you do two different methods in a block, but because I want to show you 2 different ways to join a block. So on part of it, I have just copied it onto the paper piecing paper, or whatever paper you're using. And I trimmed around my blocks, leaving the seam allowance. On the other part, I actually traced onto freezer paper. I still need to trim this off. I traced onto freezer paper, and the reason I traced is because it's 12 inches wide, and that won't fit on just a regular size sheet of paper. I trimmed all the way around on the stitching line, not the seam allowance line. And like I said, I've got to come back and trim that one. I will show you why I did each thing in both methods, and then you can decide which way you want to go. I did label which fabric went on which piece, so I didn't have to keep referring back to the pattern. So I'm going to piece each section, and then I will come back, wait to trim until I talk to you, because I believe there is an error in the pattern. The house block this month, the pieces of fabric in the kit for it, there are 5. There is a cream background that is large, that has kind of sort of swirly dots in it. That's the background. There's the piece that looks like logs or siding. That is the house fabric. The red piece is for the chimneys and for the door. The brown looks like shingles. That's the roof. And the narrow cream piece is the windows. I've included a cutting diagram in your kit, but just to show you here on camera, this is how I cut the background fabric. The first piece I cut off of the large piece that's in the kit is the 1.5 by 13 inch piece off the bottom. And then these 2 pieces are supposed to be 2.5 by 6. They're actually a little bit longer. If you want to trim them down to 6, you certainly can. I'm not going to worry about it. I will just cut them down after I put them onto my units and the paper piecing. The next 2 pieces are supposed to be 3 inches by 4.5. I do have my 3-inch width. Obviously they're longer than the 4.5. And then my last 3 pieces are 1.5 inches wide, and again those are supposed to be by 4.5, so you can trim them if you want to. From the window piece you need 5 1.5 inch squares. I gave you about a 2-inch wide piece of fabric in your kit, so rather than trimming it down to 1.5, I just cut 2-inch squares, but you can certainly cut it to 1.5 if you want to. This is the house fabric, and if you're pre-cutting that, this is how I did it. You actually have enough fabric that if you want to play with whether your siding is going vertical or horizontal, you can rotate sections and cut it the other way. My logs in this block are all going to be going horizontal. So my first cut was 2 strips that are 2.25 inches wide, and those are supposed to be by 6 inches. I just went by the width of the fabric that was in the kit. These 3 strips are 1 3/4 inches wide. They're supposed to be by 6. Again, I just left it. My next cut, I cut the strip at 5 inches and cut my 3-inch piece off, so this is a 3 by 5. And then with what was left up here, I got 6 of my 1.5 inch squares. This is scrap, and this is scrap. And finally, my last 1.5 inch square, because you need 7 of them, and this is leftovers. So again, if you want to play with your orientation, you can. There is a diagram in your kit with these cutting instructions. From the red square, and it is red rather than green, like the pattern called for the door. I believe the chimneys also. I cut a strip that is 1.5 inches wide. It's supposed to be by 3 3/4. I believe I gave you a 4-inch square, so I just left the 4 inches. You can cut it off if you want to. And 2 1.5 inch squares. These 2 pieces are scrap. For the roof, I just left the piece as it came. You will want to pay attention to which direction you're sewing this on when you do it. To me, this would be the top of the roof and this would be the bottom. If you turn it over, it doesn't look bad, so up to you. Now that I've stitched my pieces, I do have some words of advice. Be very careful. You do not have a lot of leeway in your pieces as far as width. If you don't get exactly 1/4 inch, if it's a little less when you're inside the pieces, that's okay. Just try to make sure you have at least your 1/4 inch on the outside edges. Do check and recheck to make sure your pieces are going to cover before you stitch them down. The trickiest one was this piece, and the roof went down first, and since I used freezer paper, I was able to put it down, fold back the paper, and cut my 1/4 inch. But then my other piece, which I don't have it cut, but let's pretend I'm doing a vertical one. To make sure I got the angle right, I went ahead and cut off 45 degrees. So I looked to see I need it to be cut this way to match up with this side. So to get your 45 degrees, you're going to line up the ruler, and don't take any more than you absolutely have to for this, and cut off the piece. And the reason I did that is because I can lay it down and the angle's right, but when you're stitching this, remember it's going to be flipped up like this, so it's really hard to see that it's going to cover. You can again fold it down and make sure it's going to go all the way to the edge. I did the same thing on the ends. I laid down my piece, I said okay, the angle goes this way, and I cut off 45 degrees. These pieces are plenty big enough, you have a little bit of leeway. This one is close, so watch. I'm ready to start trimming. This is section 1. This one you can trim exactly as it says in the directions. It's 6 by 5.5. And since on this piece I left the seam allowance, just check to make sure that it's really going to be 6 by 5.5. And trim. Turn and trim the other way. So line up the 6, line up the 5.5. And set that piece aside. This is section 2, and the pattern said to trim it at 3 1/4 by 5.5. But if you measure with the seam allowances on here, it measured 3 1/2 by 5.5, which is what gave me the clue that there was probably a mistake in the pattern. Cut this one the 3 1/2 by 5.5. We want the seam allowances just like they're printed on the foundation. By 5.5. And you'll notice I'm just a little bit short right here, but when I go to sew this to what else it goes to, I will still have the paper on the back. If I didn't, I would line up with these 2 longer edges. Set that one aside. The next piece is section 3, and because this one had to be bigger, then most likely this one had to be smaller, and I'll show you how I figured it out, but it's going to be easier after I have everything trimmed down. This one actually is going to need to be 4 inches by 5.5 rather than the 4 1/4 by 5.5 they said. I do not want to lose over here on my windows, so I will be taking the extra 1/4 inch off over here where it's background. So 4 by 5.5 rather than what the pattern said. Because we added a 1/4 on section 2, so we need to subtract a 1/4 on section 3. So I'm going to be cutting right on the stitching line on that side. Both of the roof pieces, or the 2 top pieces, are trimmed to 2 1/2 by 12 1/2, and because I had cut the seam allowances off on these freezer paper ones, make sure you are getting your 1/4 inch beyond the freezer paper. Don't cut right on the line. Also make sure it is 2 1/2 by 12 1/2 if you have to adjust slightly. So how did I figure out what to cut when I knew there was an error. I took the pieces and I overlapped seam allowances so that my stitching lines were right on top of each other. Actually, probably backwards. Then I took this piece that was up here on the top, and I want to make sure that my stitching lines match here and here. And I've already trimmed off that extra quarter over here, but I matched up here. The top of my roof is coming in upside down, backwards. I have them on the wrong end. But I want to make sure my roof is matching up with my house pieces. And then this end actually goes here. Sorry about that. So the eaves, or the peak in the roof, lines up with this piece. Section 2 goes here, and this one goes here. So now, because I cut off that ½ inch down here, not half, ½ inch here, and added the quarter here, it comes out to the same length as this piece. So my next step is going to be to put the sections together. Now the way I do it, since these are all trimmed, they should come out pretty close. Make sure your writing's all right side up, going 1, 2, 3. Doesn't matter whether you put 1 on 2 first or 3. Put them like this, and then I use a pin and poke it through my places where I want it to match. I make sure they line up. And when they're lined up, then put the pins in horizontal. Here and here. Then I will take it to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew all the way down this stitching line, and it should come pretty close to matching up. If you're off a hair one way or the other, no big deal. So when I have the paper that I'm stitching through, I'm going to stitch through the paper. On the ones with freezer paper, I'm still lining up. I just don't have my seam allowance in there. And the points that are critical on this are going to be where the roof meets the chimney, because I don't want the chimney hanging off the roof. So in that point, and in that one, I want to make sure that lines up, and I'll want to do it down on this end as well. And pin just like I did on the other one. Now when I take this one to stitch, I'm going to just stitch right along the cut edge of my foundation. I've sewed sections 1, 2, and 3 together, and then I sewed 4 and 5 together. If you want to put them together in consecutive order, that is perfectly okay. I just tend to like to put as many pieces together as I possibly can before I move on to the next sewing step. When we're putting these two together, there are 3 places you're going to want to match besides the outside edge. The roof right here, remember this looks bigger because we've got to take the ½ inch out up here still. So this point should match with this. This point should match down here with that seam, and this point should match with that seam. And I'm just going to use the pins to match my points exactly like I did before. Now, because I was using 2 different methods, I have the freezer paper on this side and the paper on this side. It doesn't really matter. I will probably stitch from this side, but whichever side you were comfortable with would work. This is the finished house block. After sewing it, I do have a word of advice. On this seam, it might be worthwhile to baste it first. Make sure it's how you want it, and then stitch the final seam. I'm not going to tell you how I know. If you'd like to, we can put some more of the pieces together this month. You've known for months that the square and a square unit was going to go on the bottom of the house, so it doesn't matter what your arrangement is. Just decide which way you like it on your house and sew it with a 1/4 inch seam to the bottom. I would watch on this side to make sure that I'm getting right through my intersection so I keep my points. That's the house with the square and a square units sewn on the bottom. I chose to press the seam open between the square and square units so that I didn't have a lot of bulk either going into the points or into the seams up here. So what else can we put together? You can pull out your birdhouse, and on top of it, one of the 6-unit flying geese. You can sew that on there. Next, you can take one of the fried egg flowers, a 2x4 checkerboard square, and your remaining pinwheel, and sew those together with the checkerboard between the two. Now you can take the 2 units you just made and sew the pinwheel, checkerboard, and fried egg flower to the left side of the birdhouse. Now choose 6 of your half square triangles, and we're going to sew them together in 2 rows of 3. Once you have the half square triangle units sewn together, then on the bottom of one, sew a 6-unit flying geese piece, and on the bottom of the other, one of the 2.5 by 4.5 filler blocks from the first month. Now sew the unit with the flying geese on the bottom to the top of your half square units, which have the filler block at the bottom. Now take that unit that we just put together, that's that long one, and we're going to put it on the right side of the strip we put together with the watering can and the stack and slash stars. And the strip with the watering can in it can now be added to the unit with the birdhouse after I press this seam, and then that will be most of the right side of the quilt. Then take your 4-unit flying geese piece. We're going to add one of the 2.5 by 4.5 filler blocks between it and the final stack and slash. So sew those together just like that. So now this unit that we just made can be sewn to the top of the beehive. So if you're still with me and haven't had enough, next we're going to put together a strip. There are 3 half square triangles, 1 2.5 inch square, 1 2.5 by 4.5, and 2 more half square triangles, and we're just going to put them together in a column like that. We're also going to take a fried egg flower and sew it to one of the daisies. Now that strip we just made with the half square triangles and the filler blocks can be sewn to the left side of our flag. Now the 2 flower blocks we put together can go at the top of the flag. This unit can now be attached to the top of the beehive unit. Just want to remind you that your homework this month is the flag in the house. If you choose to play along with me on putting the rest of it together, that's great. If you did, then you now have most of the right side of the quilt, most of the left side of the quilt, and some of the middle. We're getting close, and I hope you're getting excited to see the finished